In the shadow of Texas's Paloduro Canyon, one man turned loss into legend. Before there was an American cowboy, Charles Goodnight, once a 9-year-old orphan, blazed a 2,000-mile trail, survived Indian wars, and seized a chance to build the J.A. Ranch, 335,000 acres, 100,000 cattle, and more land than entire cities combined. But the ground beneath his boots had been won in a final, brutal war that ended Comanche freedom and ignited a cattle empire with a single handshake worth what would be $12 million today. How did a story born from hardship and conquest become the blueprint for the American West? The answer changes everything you thought you knew about the cowboy, and it begins here. Charles Goodnight was just 9 years old when everything changed. In 1845, his mother packed up what was left of the family and headed west, leaving Illinois for the wild promise of Texas. His father had died of pneumonia years before, and the frontier offered no mercy for a boy without a father. The journey itself was a lesson in survival, 800 miles on horseback, crossing rivers and prairies that seemed endless. Goodnight rode a white-faced mare named Blaze, learning early that endurance was the only guarantee. The Texas they found was nothing like the world they had left behind. It was raw, uncertain country, still contested by the Comanche. The Goodnight family settled near the Brazos, where every day brought new trials. Charles had only 6 months of formal schooling in his life. Instead, his education came from the land and from the people who knew how to read it. An old Caddo named Jake took the boy under his wing, teaching him how to track, hunt, and move silently through the thickets. Jake showed him how to read animal trails, find water when it seemed there was none, and sense the weather by the way the grass bent in the wind. These were not just skills. They were lifelines, the kind of knowledge that kept a person alive when the nearest neighbor was a day's ride away. By the time Charles was 11, he was already working for nearby farms, riding fence lines and herding livestock for a few coins or a meal. At 15, he tried his hand as a jockey in Port Sullivan, but the work did not suit him, and he returned home to help his mother and siblings. The family needed every able hand, and Charles took on whatever jobs he could find, plowing, planting, even supervising enslaved workers on neighboring plantations. Each task was another lesson in responsibility, another notch in the slow carving of a boy into a man who could be counted on. The frontier did not allow for childhood in the way most would imagine it. Goodnight learned to shoot, to ride, to barter, and to fight if he had to. He watched as settlers clashed with Comanche bands over land and cattle, and he saw firsthand the cost of every mistake. The land itself was both a teacher and a test, and the lessons were often harsh. Hunger was a regular companion, and the threat of violence was never far. But Charles proved himself reliable. When his stepfather, Hiram Dougherty, needed someone to help drive the family's livestock or repair a broken fence, it was Charles who stepped forward. By his teens, he had become the family's main provider, a role that would shape every decision he made in the years ahead. Through hardship, he learned to trust his own judgment and to rely on the skills passed down by those who had survived before him. The knowledge he gained from Caddo Jake and the relentless demands of frontier life would become the foundation for everything that followed. In the crucible of loss and necessity, Charles Goodnight was forging something rare on the edge of Texas, a sense of self-reliance that would one day carry him far beyond the limits of his childhood into legend. By the time he turned 20, Charles Goodnight was already riding with the Texas Rangers, a frontier force known for their grit and their willingness to go where others would not. The Rangers were not soldiers in the regular sense. They were scouts, lawmen, and sometimes the only line of defense between scattered settlers and the Comanche bands who still ruled the open plains. Goodnight joined their ranks in 1857, earning his place not by pedigree, but by proving he could track, fight, and survive where others turned back. He learned to read sign in the grass, to move at night without a lantern, and to trust the instincts that Caddo Jake had sharpened in him as a boy. In December 1860, the Rangers rode out on one of their most storied missions. A young white woman, Cynthia Ann Parker, had been taken in a Comanche raid as a child and lived among them for over 2 decades. Goodnight's scouting skills helped the Rangers pick up the faint trail along the Pease River. The party moved quietly, knowing a misstep could end in disaster. They found the Comanche camp at dawn. The fight was short and fierce. Goodnight recalled the thunder of rifles and the confusion as warriors scattered into the brush. When the smoke cleared, Cynthia Ann Parker was found alive, clutching her daughter. That day, Goodnight's name became known beyond the Brazos. He was the one who could find what others missed, the man you wanted on your side when the stakes were highest. The Civil War brought new dangers to the Texas frontier. Goodnight served in the Frontier Regiment, chasing raiders and guarding settlements from both Comanche war parties and outlaws taking advantage of the chaos. The war years taught him how to organize men, how to move supplies across empty country, and how to keep a crew together when food was short and tempers ran hot. He learned to count every round of ammunition and to measure every mile by the water holes he knew from memory. These were not lessons from books. They were written in sweat and dust and the memory of narrow escapes. When the war ended, Texas was a land of opportunity and ruin. Cattle, left wild during the fighting, roamed by the thousands, unbranded and unclaimed. Goodnight saw a chance. In 1866, he met Oliver Loving, a seasoned cattleman with a gambler's nerve. Together, they planned a drive unlike any before, 2,000 miles from Texas to the railheads of Colorado and New Mexico. The route would cross rivers, deserts, and stretches of country where a herd could vanish overnight. Goodnight built a wagon for the journey, outfitting it with everything a man might need on the trail: coffee pots, beans, bacon, and a box for medical supplies. It was the first chuck wagon, and it would become as much a symbol of the West as the Longhorn itself. The Goodnight-Loving Trail was not just a line on a map. It was a test of will. The first drive took months. Cowboys faced river crossings where cattle stampeded in panic, nights where wolves circled the herd, and days when water ran so low that men and beasts staggered under the sun. Goodnight rode at the front, scouting for grass and water, always calculating the distance to the next safe camp. He lost cattle to disease and thieves, but he brought the bulk of the herd through, proving that the open country could be crossed and that Texas beef could feed a growing nation. By the time the trail reached its end, Goodnight was no longer just a survivor of the frontier. He was its master tactician. He knew the country between the Brazos and the Canadian rivers better than any man alive. He understood how to move men and cattle across land that had broken many before him, and he had seen the Paloduro country with his own eyes: deep canyons, hidden water, grass that seemed endless. It was land worth fighting for, and he never forgot it. The skills he honed as a ranger and trail boss, discipline, resourcefulness, and an unbreakable sense of direction, would soon find their greatest test in the canyons where the Comanche once camped and where Goodnight would build his empire. At first light on September 28, 1874, the silence above Paloduro Canyon broke. Colonel Ranald Mackenzie's cavalry, guided by Tonkawa scouts, crept down the zigzag trails into the heart of the canyon. Below them, spread across the bottomlands, stood a vast encampment, hundreds of lodges from Comanche, Kiowa, and Cheyenne bands. Horses grazed in the mist, nearly every family's wealth and freedom tied to those animals. The Army's orders were clear: end the Indian wars, no matter the cost. The attack began with a single shot. Red War Bonnet, a Comanche lookout, fired his rifle to warn the camps, but he was struck down almost immediately. Panic rippled through the canyon. Warriors scrambled for weapons, women grabbed children, and the lodges erupted in chaos. The camps, scattered for miles, couldn't unite for a defense. Iron Shirt of the Cheyenne and Lone Wolf of the Kiowa tried to rally their people, but the soldiers were already among them, burning teepees and slashing open stores of dried meat. The air filled with smoke and the cries of families fleeing up the canyon walls. Mackenzie's men pushed deeper, torching everything they found. The cavalry wasn't seeking a pitched battle. They aimed to destroy the tribe's ability to survive the winter. The soldiers rounded up the horses, more than 1,400 in all, herding them into a single draw. The horses were the tribe's lifeblood, their only hope of escape or resistance. Mackenzie gave the order: shoot them all. The sound of gunfire echoed for hours as soldiers methodically killed the animals. By nightfall, The canyon floor was littered with bodies. Horses, not people, but the loss was just as final. The Tonkawa scouts took a few for themselves, but the rest were left where they fell. The destruction didn't end with the horses. Soldiers ripped open buffalo hide parfleches, spilling out pemmican and dried berries. They set fire to the lodges and burned the winter's meat stores. Blankets, tools, weapons, anything that might help the tribe survive went up in flames. The army's aim was not just to scatter the people, but to erase their ability to return. By the time Mackenzie's men withdrew, the canyon was a wasteland. Only 3 warriors and 1 soldier had been killed in the fighting, but the real damage was measured in what could not be replaced. That night, as the soldiers camped on the rim, the survivors huddled in the cold, watching the smoke rise from what had been their home. The Comanche, Kiowa, and Cheyenne who escaped the onslaught faced a choice between surrender and starvation. Paloduro Canyon, once a sanctuary, was now stripped bare. The tribe's power to resist had ended with the loss of their horses and their food. By winter, most had made the long walk to Fort Sill, forced onto reservations far from their ancestral lands. The scale of the defeat was total. 2 centuries of Plains Indian dominance in the Texas Panhandle ended in a single day, not by the sword, but by the destruction of everything needed to live free on the land. With the canyon emptied, the fate of the country changed. The land that had sheltered generations of Comanche and Kiowa now stood open, its grass untrampled, its water unclaimed. For settlers and cattlemen watching from a distance, the path was suddenly clear. The last stand at Paloduro had left the heart of the Panhandle vacant, waiting for the next empire to take root. October 23, 1876. Charles Goodnight reached the rim of Paloduro Canyon with 1,600 head of longhorn cattle trailing behind him. The canyon below stretched for miles, its walls painted in red and ochre, the river winding through the bottom like a promise. 2 years had passed since Mackenzie's cavalry had driven out the last Comanche bands. Now, the only sounds were the bawling of cattle and the steady clop of hooves on rocky soil. Goodnight had scouted this country before. He knew where the springs bubbled out of the canyon walls, where the grass grew thickest, and where the bluffs offered shelter from the wind. He chose his camp with a tactician's eye, settling near the prairie dog town fork of the Red River, where water ran year-round and the land rose gently to meet the plains. The canyon offered more than beauty. Its steep walls shielded cattle from winter storms that swept across the Panhandle, and its maze of side draws made natural corrals for working stock. Timber grew in the draws, ready for building dugouts and corrals. The grass, untouched for generations, stood belly-high and rich. Goodnight understood that whoever controlled water and shelter in this country would control everything. He set about claiming the best spots, every spring, every patch of timber, every bend in the river that could support a herd or a line camp. He built his first dugout from cottonwood and cedar, using abandoned Comanche lodgepoles for rafters, and set up corrals with the same deliberate care he'd learned driving cattle up the Goodnight-Loving trail. The legal paperwork would come later. For now, occupation was the law of the land. Surveyors like Jot Gunter and William B. Munson had already plotted much of the Panhandle, and Goodnight made deals to secure the choicest parcels, always pressing for land with water access. He scattered his claims across the canyon, making it nearly impossible for any rival to carve out a competing operation. The land was cheap, 75 cents an acre in some places, a little more in others, but Goodnight's real currency was timing. He moved in before the rush, staking out the canyon's heart while others hesitated. Every decision reflected years of hard-won experience. He kept his herd close, driving them into the side canyons for shelter and letting them fatten on grass that had never known a cow's hoof. He hired men he trusted, cowboys who could ride the rim in a blue norther or rope a wild steer in the brush. Supplies came by wagon from Dodge City or Denver, but the canyon provided most of what they needed: wood for fires, stone for coolers, and game for the pot. The dugout became headquarters, a beacon for the crews who would soon spread out along the canyon's 75-mile length. By winter, Goodnight's cattle grazed peacefully where just 2 years before, Comanche ponies had thundered and war lodges had stood. The transformation was swift but not accidental. Goodnight had watched the old order fall and recognized, before most, that the future belonged to those who could act quickly and read the land's true value. He didn't wait for government surveys or distant investors. He took the canyon by presence, by labor, and by a shrewd understanding of what made this country different from any other. In the months that followed, word spread across Texas and Colorado that Goodnight had claimed the Paloduro. Other cattlemen would come, but none would match his head start. By the time John Adair arrived with his fortune and his vision of empire, the foundation was already laid. Goodnight had not just occupied the canyon, he had made it work for him, turning its wild geography into the backbone of an operation that would soon stretch farther than anyone could ride in a single day. In the canyon's silence, the next chapter of the American West was quietly taking root. The deal that built the J.A. Ranch started with a handshake in Denver, but it quickly became something far more substantial. On June 18, 1877, Charles Goodnight and John Adair put their agreement in writing, a 5-year contract that would transform both men's fortunes. Adair, an Irish financier with deep pockets and a taste for bold ventures, committed the capital. Goodnight, already known across the Texas Panhandle, brought his hard-won experience and the herd he'd driven into Paloduro. The terms were clear. Adair would claim 2/3 of all property and profits, while Goodnight took 1/3 and a yearly salary of $2,500. To cover his share, Goodnight borrowed from Adair at 10% interest, a costly loan, but one he was willing to risk. Land was the real prize. Goodnight moved fast, buying the first 12,000 acres from surveyors Jot Gunter and William Munson for 75 cents an acre, with an option on another 12,000. He picked the choicest parcels, always with water and grass in mind. The ranch didn't grow as one tidy block. Instead, Goodnight scattered his claims across the canyon, staking out every spring, every bend in the river, and every patch of timber that could shelter a herd. It was a patchwork empire, stitched together by shrewd deals and a sharp eye for opportunity. By 1882, the ranch had expanded to 93,000 acres. Within a few years, it would stretch across 6 counties, covering 335,000 acres, more land than the city of Los Angeles and the entire state of Rhode Island put together. The numbers were staggering for the time. At its peak, the J.A. Ranch ran 100,000 head of cattle, each one branded with Adair's initials. The payroll listed 150 full-time cowboys, men who earned $30 a month and their keep, good wages for the frontier. The ranch's operations were as carefully organized as any military campaign. Each cowboy was assigned a string of horses, a bunk in one of the line camps, and a place in the daily rhythm of work that kept the ranch running through blizzards, droughts, and the endless demands of the range. Goodnight's management style set the tone for the entire operation. He insisted on discipline: no gambling, no whiskey, no fighting. Cowboys who broke the rules were sent packing. The ranch ran on respect, skill, and a sense of order that was rare in the open country. The headquarters complex grew to match the scale of the enterprise: a sturdy house of cedar logs, a bunkhouse for the men, a blacksmith shop, wagon yard, and a meat cooler that used the canyon's natural chill to preserve food. Supplies came in by wagon from Dodge City, but most of what was needed could be found or built on site. The J.A. brand became a mark of quality, recognized from the railheads at Dodge City all the way to the markets back east. Cattle drives left the canyon every spring, led by seasoned trail bosses and crews who knew the country by heart. Each drive was a test of organization and nerve, but the real strength of the ranch was its ability to operate at a scale few could match. The payroll, the land, the herds, everything about the J.A. Ranch spoke to a new era in Texas ranching, one where vision and capital worked hand in hand to create something that would last. By the early 1880s, the partnership had paid off beyond anyone's expectations. Profits topped $500,000, and the ranch's reputation was secure. The combination of Adair's money and Goodnight's know-how had built an empire, one that would set the standard for the American West and define what it meant to be a cowboy. A cowboy's day on the J.A. Ranch began before dawn, and it was order, not chaos, that set the tone. Charles Goodnight believed that civilization, even on the farthest edge of the frontier, started with systems. His most famous invention, the chuck wagon, changed everything about life on the trail. Before Goodnight, cowboys fended for themselves, cooking over open fires and eating whatever they could carry. In 1866, he repurposed a Studebaker army wagon, building a sloped wooden box at the back that folded down into a work table. Inside, drawers and shelves held flour, beans, bacon, coffee, and a battered Dutch oven, the core of every meal. A water barrel was strapped to the side. The cook, always the first awake, brewed coffee so strong it could float a horseshoe. The chuck wagon became the heart of the outfit, a rolling kitchen and social center that kept men fed and morale high, no matter how rough the country or how long the drive. Goodnight brought the same practical genius to the ranch itself. He set strict rules: no gambling, no whiskey, no fighting. Cowboys who broke the code were let go, no matter how skilled. The JA payroll listed 150 full-time hands at its peak, each earning $30 a month in their keep, a solid wage for the 1880s, equal to about $750 today. Goodnight expected his men to be professionals. He assigned each a string of horses, a bunk in one of the line camps, and a place in the daily rhythm of work. Line camps, scattered across the ranch's 75-mile sweep, allowed cowboys to watch over distant herds year-round. Some camps were little more than dugouts or sod shacks, but they offered shelter from the wind and a place to dry boots after a week on the range. Discipline ran deeper than paychecks and rules. Goodnight introduced a formal structure to cowboy life, with the trail boss at the top and a clear hierarchy below: point riders, swingmen, flankers, and drags. Each role had its purpose, just as each tool did. The branding iron, the lariat, the Winchester rifle, all had their place, but so did the written records Goodnight kept on every head of cattle. He tracked breeding lines and calving rates, aiming to improve the herd year after year. In 1882, he built the Panhandle's first barbed wire drift fence, stretching across a canyon bed above the home ranch. The wire, twisted and sharp, changed the West forever. It kept herds from drifting in winter storms, separated purebred stock from the main herd, and made cattle theft harder than ever. Barbed wire was cheap, strong, and easy to repair. By the mid-1880s, the JA Ranch had miles of it, fencing off water, grass, and timber in a way the open range had never seen. Innovation didn't stop at steel and wood. Goodnight believed in better cattle, not just more of them. He imported Durham bulls to cross with Texas Longhorns, then shifted to Herefords after the Durhams disappointed. He kept purebred herds in fenced pastures, branding them with a JJ to track the bloodlines. His breeding records were meticulous, and the results spoke for themselves: heavier, hardier cattle that fetched higher prices in Dodge City and beyond. The ranch even experimented with bison and cattle crosses, catalo, as Goodnight called them, hoping to blend the toughness of the buffalo with the beef of the cow. Every tool, every rule, every system was a piece of the larger design. Goodnight saw the cowboy not as a drifting laborer, but as a skilled worker worthy of respect and fair pay. The chuck wagon, the barbed wire, the breeding pens, and the line camps. These weren't just conveniences. They were the bones of a new order, one that turned wild country into working country and made the cowboy a symbol of American possibility. The systems built at the JA Ranch didn't just keep cattle alive. They built a culture, one that endures in every code of the West. 300,000 visitors make their way to Paloduro Canyon each year, drawn by the same sweeping vistas and hidden springs that once lured Charles Goodnight. The canyon's floor stretches out for miles, its red walls rising high above a landscape shaped by wind, water, and the passing of herds. Today, the land echoes with different footsteps: families on day hikes, school groups tracing the old cattle trails, horseback riders following paths once cut by cowboys. The park welcomes travelers with 16 marked trails, each one offering a glimpse of the wild country that became the heart of the JA Ranch. Some visitors climb the Lighthouse Trail, a winding route that leads to the famous stone spire standing over the canyon. Others camp beneath the rim, waking to the sound of wind in the cottonwoods, just as Goodnight's cowboys did a century before. Cabins named for pioneers, Goodnight, Sorensen, Lighthouse, sit perched above the canyon, their porches facing the sunrise. Reservations fill up months in advance, a testament to the enduring pull of this place. The park's amphitheater hosts the musical drama Texas every summer, telling the story of the Panhandle settlement in the very spot where Comanche camps once stood. For many, the real draw is the chance to walk where history happened. The canyon's trails pass over the same ground crossed by cavalry and cattle herds, by Comanche families and the first ranch hands. Here, the past feels close. Every visitor leaves their own mark, joining a long line of travelers who have come to see the birthplace of cowboy culture for themselves. The cowboy who rode for the J.A. Ranch became something more than a hired hand. Over time, his image took on a life of its own, spilling out of the canyons and into the national imagination. Hollywood found its muse in stories like these, spinning legends from the real men who once worked this land. Long before the cameras rolled, Charles Goodnight had already written the script. The rough code of conduct, the long cattle drives, the life built on skill and grit. Larry McMurtry's Lonesome Dove drew directly from the partnership between Goodnight and Oliver Loving, turning their journey into a saga that would win the Pulitzer Prize and anchor one of the most beloved miniseries in American television. The characters of Call and McCrae, shaped by the Goodnight-Loving trail, brought the frontier's hardships and loyalties to living rooms across the country. Even in classic films like Red River, echoes of Goodnight's innovations, his chuck wagon, his trail boss system, show up in every campfire scene and stampede. The real reach of the J.A. Ranch runs deeper than silver screens. In Texas classrooms, students learn about Goodnight's legacy as part of their foundational history. The Texas Essential Knowledge and Skills Standards require fourth graders to study the origins of cowboy life, and Goodnight's name appears in textbooks as the architect of the Panhandle's cattle empire. Teachers tell of the 335,000 acres, the first formal codes of the range, and the invention of the chuck wagon, a story that's as much about ingenuity as it is about survival. The story endures in other ways too. Paloduro Canyon draws visitors who may not know they're walking the ground where cowboy culture was born. The summer crowds at the park's amphitheater watch the musical Texas, hearing tales that began with Goodnight's herd and the men who rode for him. Each year, a new crop of students, tourists, and would-be cowboys encounter the J.A. Ranch in textbooks, documentaries, and the stories that pass from one generation to the next. The myth of the American cowboy, tough, honorable, self-reliant, owes much of its shape to the real lives lived here. What started as a working code in a dugout on the canyon floor has become a symbol recognized far beyond Texas. That's the legacy of the J.A., not just a ranch, but the blueprint for an American legend. At its height, the J.A. Ranch stretched over 335,000 acres, more land than Los Angeles, Chicago, and New York City combined. Charles Goodnight's transformation from orphaned frontier boy to architect of the American cowboy was rooted in hard fact. A $500,000 handshake in 1876, 100,000 cattle driven by 150 cowboys, and innovations like the chuck wagon and barbed wire that changed ranching forever. The Red River War of 1874 opened Paloduro Canyon to settlement, but the full stories of Comanche resistance and the personal lives of J.A.'s cowboys are still partly lost to history, with many first-hand accounts missing from the record. Today, over 300,000 visitors walk the canyon each year, retracing the paths where history was forged. The J.A. Ranch model, documented in Texas textbooks and echoed in Hollywood, remains the blueprint for cowboy culture. The legacy of vision, hardship, and transformation on this land is as real and enduring as the canyon walls themselves.